In 1991, Brian Kendall and his young family were tired of living the busy city life. He worked in Baltimore, Maryland. He was a carpenter by trade, but he and his wife, Belinda, had grown up in the country in West Virginia, and they decided to move back there, even though that would mean a multi-hour-long commute for Brian to get back to Baltimore to do work, because he still worked in Baltimore. So Brian and Belinda start looking for places to live in West Virginia, and they find this nice home in Slanesville, West Virginia, which has a population of 182 people last time I checked. The house itself had more of a cabin feel to it. I mean, it was way out in the middle of this forest, no neighbors anywhere. It was a ranch style, so single floor, and basically everywhere you looked was just pure forest. So this cabin is super isolated, but Brian and Belinda had come from a neighborhood that wasn't very safe, and they didn't like sending their kids outside without supervision. Now, living in the middle of nowhere, they could at least let their kids go outside and not really worry about them. So even though it might have been lonely, they felt like it was at least safe. And Brian went out and got a beautiful, friendly black lab dog to come and protect the property, and her name was Coco. They loved Coco. She was very protective of the kids right away, and she blended in with the family immediately. And very quickly, the family really took to living in Slanesville. They loved their new home and their new life. Everything was just going so well at first. Shortly after they had moved into the house and finally unpacked, Belinda invited her brother as well as her brother's wife and daughter named Jordan to come over and check out the house. And so they come over. Belinda had gotten a cake and some balloons, and she planned on throwing a little mini surprise party for Jordan, who was about the same age as her kids and had recently had a birthday, and so they figured they would surprise her, give her some cake, and have a little impromptu birthday party. After cake, the kids went into the living room and were playing in there together. The living room was right next to the kitchen, and so the adults were in the kitchen having coffee and chatting. And as they're chatting, they all noticed something very strange going on in the living room with the kids. The kids had taken all of the balloons and brought them into the living room, and they had all floated up to the ceiling, and there was pretty high ceilings inside of this living room. And as the adults are looking in the direction of the kids and these balloons, they notice one of the balloons comes down from the ceiling, but the string is tight, as if someone's holding the balloon and pulling it down, but no one was pulling on the balloon. The adults stopped talking, and they've all noticed this, and they're all looking at it, because it looked very unnatural. The balloon stops right in the middle of the room, and it's a ways away from the kids, and the kids haven't noticed it. And the parents are just quietly watching this balloon, and no one knows what to make of it. No one's even commenting that this is happening. They're all just quiet and watching. And the balloon starts moving across the room over to where Jordan was. Jordan notices the balloon for the first time. She turns and goes, "Thank you," as if she's talking to someone, but no one's there. She reaches out to take the balloon, and as she goes to grab it, it drifts right back up to the ceiling, as if someone had been holding it and let go of it. And Jordan kind of grabbed for it, watched it go to the ceiling, and then Jordan just turned around and kept on playing. That startled everybody. They could make sense of a balloon coming down and then moving. The helium could be leaking, there could be a draft in the room, but for it to go right back up and look like someone had released it, they couldn't explain that. And so the parents go right in the living room. They're looking at each other. The parents are, and they're like, "Did you see that? What was that about?" And they grab that balloon down from the ceiling, and they're trying to replicate what they saw. And they're kind of looking at each other like, "Are we going crazy?" And they go over to Jordan and they say, "Hey, who were you talking to a minute ago?" And she couldn't really articulate anything. And they said, "When the balloon was right here in front of you, who are you talking to?" And she stops and kind of thinks about it for a second. She's a young kid, she's like 2 or 3 years old. She thinks about it and she points in the direction where no one's standing and goes, "Him." The parents look in the direction of where she's pointing. They look at each other and then they start laughing because they're like, "Okay, we're scaring ourselves. Obviously, the helium must have come out and maybe there's a draft and she's 3. She doesn't know what she's talking about. She's probably got an imaginary friend. We're just scaring each other. Let's just drop it. Let's forget the balloon." And so they do. They forget the balloon and they don't think about it again. But after Jordan and her parents leave, Belinda and Brian would say to each other, "That was pretty weird." A couple of days later, Brian asked his daughter, Blair, who was about 5 or 6 years old, if she wanted to come with him and go explore the back forest behind their property, because Brian had been working so much, he hadn't really had a chance to go explore, and he figured now's a good chance to go. Blair's super excited. The two of them go out into the backyard and they start walking around. And after walking a bit of a ways, they stop because they see something in the middle of the forest that shouldn't have been there. They see this van, like a vehicle, that looked like it had been set on fire at one point. It's totally charred. It's basically just a frame, and it's parked in the middle of the forest. and there are no roads anywhere. And they go in the back of the vehicle and look inside, and there are all these burnt stuffed animals and kids' toys that are in the back of this van. And there is what looks to be the spring of a mattress that must have been caught up in this fire that burned the vehicle. And Brian just had this sinking feeling that something was wrong with this scene. And he said, hey, you know what, Blair, we gotta go. Let's not look at this. We don't know what this is. Let's just go. When they get back to the house, Brian would tell Belinda what he found. How would that van have gotten there? And why was it there? It just didn't make any sense to either of them. Over the first couple of months that they were living in Slanesville, Brian was trying to commute daily to his work in Maryland, but it was taking up hours and hours of his day. He was getting no sleep, and it just didn't make sense. And so even though they only had one car, he started commuting on Monday morning to work and then staying with his mom, who lived in Maryland, and then coming back to Slanesville on Friday night, which would mean that every week, Monday to Friday, Belinda and the kids would be alone in their cabin in the woods in Slanesville with no vehicle. But Belinda had grown up in a very isolated house in the middle of a forest in West Virginia, so she wasn't a stranger to this type of setup, and so really didn't have any issues with this lifestyle that they had in Slanesville. Blair had been asking ever since they moved in if she could go camping one night out in their RV. They had a little RV camper that was parked right outside their property, and she wanted to spend a night out there by herself. And so one week when Brian was away for work, Belinda finally caved and said, okay, Blair, you can stay in the camper tonight. She wasn't thrilled about this idea, but she felt like the kids had a little bit of cabin fever going on because they were so cooped up in this house, and she figured this is an easy way to make Blair feel a little bit happier living here. So she told Blair, once you go in there, I want you to lock the door and not open it again. And Coco, their dog, is going to stay with you. Blair was just fine with this setup. And so that night she went out to the camper. She had Coco with her. She had all her warm clothes on. She brought a lantern with her and some books she was going to read. She goes out and her mom tucks her into her bed inside of the RV and gives her a kiss, and then she leaves. In the camper, there was a pull-out bed that she was on that took up the majority of the floor space in the camper. On her right, as she was laying down, was a big window with a blackout curtain that slid across the whole thing, and she kept that curtain shut. At the foot of her bed to the right was the door that led into the camper, and there was a window on that as well, but there was no blind to block it. And so at some point, Blair is tired. She turns off her lantern and she gets under her covers with Coco right next to her, and she goes to sleep. At some point in the night, Blair wakes up suddenly because Coco is acting really strange. She's very uneasy, and she's looking towards the door that leads into the camper, and she's acting like she just saw something. So Blair sits up, she's trying to calm down Coco, and she looks at the window on the door, and she can look outside. There's a little bit of moonlight outside, so she's got a little bit of illumination, and as she's looking, she sees what looks like a figure walk past the door. She can't tell if it's a person or if it's an animal or what it is, but she definitely saw something walk past the door. And Coco clearly saw it too, because Coco begins growling, and instead of just looking at the door where this figure was, Coco basically follows the figure and is now looking at the window right next to Blair. Blair thinks it's her mom, and so she tries to calm down Coco. She turns on her lantern and she goes to the front door and she peeks her head out. She doesn't see anything. She unlocks it and opens it and pokes her head out. She doesn't see her, and she goes, "Mom?" And there's no one out there. She looks up at the house, which is right next to her, and all the lights are off. There's no sign that her mom left the house. Suddenly feeling really startled, she shuts the door, locks it, and goes back in her bed. Now, the whole time that Blair had turned that lantern on and gone down to the door and yelled for her mom, Coco was still in the bed looking at the window where the blackout curtains were covering up whatever was on the other side. Now, when Blair's going back to the bed, Coco is showing her teeth. She's baring her teeth and she's growling at the window. Blair's totally spooked. She jumps into her bed, throws the covers over her head, and she's sitting there hoping that Coco will just stop and that this will all end and she can go to sleep, but Coco doesn't stop. And she's like reaching out and trying to pull Coco to get under the covers with her, but Coco won't stop. Blair decides she has to take a look out that window, and she thinks maybe it is my mom. Maybe I just missed her before and she's trying to come in. Maybe she was knocking and I didn't hear her. And so she takes her covers off her head, gets right up next to the side of the wall. She's underneath the window, which is right next to her. And she starts pulling aside that curtain. And as soon as she's got a view out the window, she sees a dark figure that looks like a man or something standing right outside the glass, looking down into her camper. She she's so scared, she drops the curtain and then just gets under her covers. Coco goes right on top of Blair and is standing over Blair, basically protecting her. And at some point, Blair does manage to fall asleep. Meanwhile, on the same night, there was some other drama happening up at the main house. Belinda had put Blair's younger brother, Sean, to bed almost immediately after she tucked in Blair inside of the camper. Sean was 3 years old and he was a great sleeper. She could put him in his bed, say goodnight to him, and she wouldn't see him until the next morning. But that night, Belinda was laying in bed, and Sean multiple times would get out of his bed and come into her bedroom and say he was scared and didn't want to be in his room. Belinda would get up, she'd go back, she'd tuck him back in and say, "You got nothing to worry about, it's just a new house, you're fine, you're safe." But on the third or fourth time that this happened, because it was so out of character, she asked Sean, "What's going on? What are you so scared of?" And he says, "There's a monster in my window." Belinda assumes what he means is maybe a deer was outside or some other animal might have walked by the window, because in virtue of being a single-story house, all of the bedroom windows are at ground level. And so she goes to the window and she looks out, and it's just forest, deep, dark forest everywhere you look. And so she's thinking, okay, maybe a deer walked by the window or a moose or something like that, and that's what he saw. And so she was able to explain to him that, it's just a new house, there's probably some deer that are coming by the window, you got nothing to worry about. And so she was able to finally calm him down and he would go to sleep. The next morning, Blair is relieved to wake up and have sunlight be coming through that little open window on the front door. She and Coco go into the main house. She sits down for breakfast with her mom and with her brother, and Belinda asks her how was camping. And Blair, who was normally a very chatty child, was very quiet about it. And her mom said, "Well, did you have a good time? Like, you gonna tell me anything about it?" And Blair just said, "I don't think I want to go camping again." And she didn't elaborate. She just didn't want to talk about it. And so Belinda didn't ask any more questions, and that was that. That day goes by without incident. And then that night, Belinda gets Sean and Blair to bed in their normal rooms. They're asleep. Belinda goes to her bed and she falls asleep. And she starts to have this very strange dream. In her dream, she wakes up and looks at the foot of her bed and she sees a boy she doesn't recognize. And he's signaling her to come with him. And so in her dream, she gets up out of her bed and she follows him out of her room and she goes out to the front yard, and it's daylight outside. And on her front yard are all these clotheslines strung all over the front yard. And there are these white sheets that are hanging from each of these clotheslines, all in different random directions. And she's trying to find this boy, and she can't find him because all the sheets keep getting in her way. She finally stops because she feels something on her toe. And she looks down, she's barefoot, and on her right big toe is a clothespin that had been pinched onto her toe. And so she reaches down and pulls it off, and that's when she wakes up. And now she's awake in real life. And so she sits up and she's kind of looking around, and she's in that immediate fog following a really vivid dream. And then she realizes that was just a dream, gets back in bed, and she goes to sleep. The next day she gets up, she gets out of her bed, and she begins pulling her blankets up to make her bed. As she's walking around the foot of the bed, she stops because she sees something on the ground. A clothespin. They don't own any clothespins. And so she's sitting there looking at it thinking, how could that have gotten there? What was that dream about? Was I awake? Was I doing something in my sleep? Was I sleepwalking? She can't make sense of it, but it totally freaked her out. That day, Belinda told her sister about this dream with the clothespin and then finding it at the foot of the bed. And her sister's like, "Look, you probably just need a break. You're alone with the kids all the time. You're isolated. Let me come over. I'll watch the kids and you can just go for a walk and do whatever. Just clear your mind." And so Belinda's sister comes over, takes the kids, and Belinda decides that what she's going to do is go explore the woods behind their house. She walks a little ways behind their property and she sees something that really stands out to her. It was a little cemetery, and it was on their property, or at least close to their property. She goes over to it and sees there are 4 small headstones. There's no writing on them, but the size of the headstone themselves, it seemed to indicate that these could have been children. And so she was very unsettled by it and decided that, you know what, I'm done with my walk and I'm just going to go back now. A couple of days later, Blair was sleeping in her room when she woke up suddenly for no apparent reason. She sat up, she kind of looked around, and she noticed that the curtains that normally would cover up her window that overlooked her bed were open. And she felt really uneasy by this, especially after that incident in the RV. She liked having those curtains closed. So she gets up to go over and shut this curtain, and she looks out the window and she sees standing in front of the tree line is a dark silhouette of a figure. It looks like a man or some person. And she freezes. and she's looking at it, and she can tell that it's moving towards her. And she's looking even closer, and then she can tell it's now running at her. She shuts it, jumps into her bed, and covers herself up. As she's laying there under her covers, not knowing what to do, she hears Coco barking from her mom's room. Belinda wakes up to Coco barking and looks at what she's looking at, and it's the window. So Belinda gets up, she looks out the window, she doesn't see anything, and tells Coco to calm down. She figured, okay, maybe she saw a deer or something, and then just to be a good mom, she checks on her kids. She goes to Sean's room. Sean didn't wake up from the barking. He's asleep in his bed. But when Belinda goes into Blair's room, Blair is hiding under her covers and she's scared of something. And she asks Blair, honey, what's wrong? And Blair finally says that she saw something. She thought it was a person. She didn't know what, but it was running towards the house. And so Belinda's thinking to herself, she just saw an animal. Because that's probably what Sean saw when he thought he saw a monster outside. And I'm sure that's what Coco saw. You know, Coco's going to react to an animal. There's probably some deer that's coming right up to the window and it's scaring my kids, it's scaring my dog. And so Belinda tells Blair, you got nothing to worry about, honey. Go back to sleep. Everything's going to be fine. She calms her down. She puts her to sleep. She double checks on Sean. Sean's still sleeping. And Belinda and Coco go back into Belinda's room and they get in bed and Belinda goes back to sleep. At some point in the night, Belinda's laying with her back to the door and she feels someone tapping on the back of her head. And she's assuming at this point it's got to be Sean or even Blair who've come in there because they're scared again. And reflexively, without even opening her eyes, she says, honey, there's nothing outside. You get nothing to be scared of. Go back to sleep. There's a silence. And then she feels tapping on her head again. Now she opens her eyes and she rolls over to tell one of her two kids that everything's fine, but there's no one there. It startles her because not only is there no one there, but Coco is now on the bed growling in the direction of wherever this tapping was coming from. Immediately, Belinda flips on the light and she's looking around her room and there's nothing. Gets up and she goes into her kids' rooms. They are fast asleep. Just to be sure, she walks around the house, makes sure everything is locked. She gets back in her bed and she's sitting there with Coco and she can't help it. She's scared. Between her kids seeing stuff outside, finding that cemetery, the weird clothespin thing going on, now something feeling like it was tapping her but no one's in the room with her. She's scared. And in fact, she would say in interviews that this was the first time that she even thought about the word haunted in relationship to what was going on at their house. The next day, Belinda just wanted to get away from the house. So she calls her mom and says, hey, can we use your car for the day to go run some errands? Her mom says, absolutely. Her mom drops the car off and Belinda and the kids load up and they head into town. When they left, they put Coco in her outdoor cage, totally locked and secure. So they head out and they go to this gas station in Slanesville and Belinda gets out, she's fueling up her car and another resident of Slanesville pulls up right next to her and she's filling up her car. And the two women strike up a conversation. At some point in this discussion, the woman asks Belinda where she lives in Slanesville because she's a longtime resident and she didn't recognize Belinda. Belinda describes where she lives and the woman who's familiar with the area says, well, do you know the story of your property? And Belinda's like, no. She's like, well, years and years ago, there was a really bad fire. I think it was right near your property that a whole family died in. And Belinda says, you know what? I actually found a small cemetery a little ways back on our property, but that's what it is. As Belinda is driving away and she's thinking about this story she's been told, she has this sense of relief that now she has some closure on why there's that cemetery on her property. And she couldn't help but think, if her house is haunted, which she had only recently considered, maybe it's not such a bad thing to have it be this family that's doing the haunting. It didn't feel evil, it just felt kind of sad, and she was empathetic for this lost family. When they got back from running those errands, Coco was gone. They went to the fence and it hadn't been opened. There was no sign that she had been able to burrow underneath this fence. There was no way for her to get out unless you opened the gate, and it was locked and shut. And so they didn't know what to make of that, and the only thing they could come up with is someone must have taken Coco. And unfortunately, they would never see Coco again. It was a huge loss for this family. Coco was not only a dog they loved and considered part of their family, but she was also their protection, and it was a very big deal that she was gone. A couple of days go by and Brian's home from work and everyone in the house is asleep except for Belinda. Belinda was up watching TV, and at some point she turns off the TV and she also goes to bed. She starts having the same dream she had when she felt that clothespin on her toe. In her dream, she wakes up and at the foot of her bed is this boy, the same boy that she had followed outside that she could never find in the sheets. And so she gets up and she starts following this boy. He brings her out to the front of the house. out onto the front yard. And again, the whole front yard is covered in these white sheets that are strung up along clotheslines. And as she's making her way across the front yard, pulling sheets aside, she finally reaches a clearing and she sees this boy who looks like about the same age as her son, Sean. And this boy looks terrified, and she's looking at him, and the boy is kind of looking to his left. And then from behind one of the sheets next to the boy walks this dark figure that stands right next to him and looks up at her. And it's an expressionless, dark figure. It almost looks like a man. And it starts walking up the lane of sheets towards her. She falls over backwards and she wakes up. And when she wakes up in real life, she hears screaming coming from her own son's room. She and Brian jump up out of bed and run into Sean's room. He's laying on the ground with his arm cocked to the side. It's clearly been broken. And he's screaming and guarding his arm. And Belinda's over him saying, "What happened? What happened?" And the boy just says, "The monster came in the window." They don't know what to make of this. They're not sure if that means an intruder came in or what, but they have to get him to the hospital. They scoop him up, they grab Blair, and they get in the car and they leave. They get Sean to the hospital, and sure enough, he's got a very bad break in his arm and he needs to stay at the hospital for a couple of days. Now, this happened on a Sunday night, and so Brian had to go back to Maryland the next day for work. So their car was gone. So 3 days later, when it was time to get Sean, Belinda had to borrow her mother's car to go pick him up. So Belinda gets her mother's car and she and Blair drive to the hospital. They pick up Sean. As they're driving back, the car breaks down and they're on the side of the road with flashers on, and Belinda doesn't know what to do. Luckily, a good Samaritan is driving by. Another resident of Slanesville sees them pulled over. She pulls over. It's an older woman, and she says, "Hey, can I give you guys a ride?" Belinda's like, "Thank you. Yes, we need a ride." So she, Sean, and Blair load up in the car and they start driving to their house. And so Belinda tells this woman where she lives. "Yep, you take this road, you get up to our house. It's set back in the woods there." And when she realizes where Belinda lives, she looks at Belinda and goes, "You do know the history of your house, right?" And Belinda looks at her and goes, "Yeah, the fire that killed the family, we're aware." She goes, "No, not a fire. The last occupant of your house was rumored to be hurting children on your property. And there was no proof, but some of the local men here decided they were going to take justice into their own hands, and they convinced this guy to go hunting with them. And they brought him out in the woods behind his house, and they ambushed him, and his body's never been found. It's rumored there's a van somewhere in the woods near your house where they put him inside of it, shut the doors, and lit it on fire." Belinda's in shock hearing this, because now, if her house is haunted, which she's believing it is, it's not some nice family that was sadly lost in a fire. It's this horrible man. They finally got back to the house. They said bye to the woman, and Belinda and her kids went inside. And for Belinda, it was like this horrible sense of dread being in the house. It just felt evil. And she realized that she couldn't stay there anymore. So she picks up the phone, she calls Brian, and she says, "I cannot stay here another night. I have to go." And so Brian says, okay. He drives back from Maryland. They pack some bags, they get in his car, and they all leave for Brian's mom's house. And that was it. They never stayed another night at that house. They only went back a couple times to pack up their stuff, put it in moving trucks, and they left. So I'd love to get your feedback on this story. Do you think that the house was indeed haunted, or do you think there's some other explanation? In 2006, Dave Murphy had just become a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. His first role was as a protective service officer, which meant he'd be in charge of physical security at a number of the county facilities. Dave's first facility was the Capital City Theater, which is a landmark inside of Salt Lake City. It's been around since the early 1900s. It's this beautiful, grand theater. So in early August, Dave reports to the Capital City Theater for his first day on the job, and he meets his partner, an officer by the name of Morgan Matthews. He gets there on this first day, and right away, Dave would say that Morgan was just strictly business. The first place that Morgan takes Dave is the control room, which sits on the first floor of the theater. The theater had 3 floors, and then it also had a basement as well. So the control room was on that first floor. Inside of the control room were all of the security monitors, because there was all these cameras set up inside of the theater. The cameras weren't great though. You pretty much could only tell what was in frame if there was a light on, and most of the time at night especially, lights were off. Once they were done looking at the control room, Morgan says to Dave, "Now we're gonna go do our rounds. This is something we do every time you get to the theater. You do a security round and make sure everything's locked, all the lights are off. before you come back to the control room. You'll do that at the beginning of your shift and at the end of your shift. Morgan brings Dave downstairs, and it's the first time Dave is seeing the basement, and he's shocked by how big it is. It is this massive hallway that stretches way down. In the middle of the hall is a piano that's just sitting out in the middle, and the lighting's not good down there. This is a very old theater. You know, everything in the building was pretty old. And Dave remembers thinking that he was immediately creeped out by this scene, this long hallway with all these doors and this piano right in the middle of the hallway. And he's thinking to himself, I don't want to spend much time down here. This is so creepy. But they go down the hall, they check all the doors, they make their way up to the main floor, the second floor, the third floor, everything gets checked. And so after they do this security round, Dave and Morgan go back to the control room, and Dave is anticipating getting to know Morgan a little bit. This is their first night. They're going to be working together a lot. And Dave would say that Morgan just seemed really cold and just did not want to talk to Dave very much. And as soon as their shift was almost over, Morgan was very eager to just knock out the security rounds and just get out of that building. At the end of that night, Dave remembers thinking that there's just something off about Morgan's behavior. It seemed like Morgan really didn't like being in the theater. And it would turn out that he was onto something, because Morgan didn't like being in that building. But it would take him a while to share with Dave why. Over the next couple of days, Morgan and Dave would do their security rounds together because Dave's in training, Morgan's teaching him. But on August 9th, which is 2 days after Dave's first day on the job, Morgan was confident that Dave knew how to secure the whole building. And so at the end of the night, he tells Dave, why don't you do the security rounds yourself? Dave feels very confident that he knows how to do it. He goes down into the basement, makes sure all the doors are shut and locked, that the lights are off, finishes the basement, goes up to the first floor where the control room is and checks all the rooms on that floor. He goes into the main auditorium space. He's checking all the different nooks and crannies to make sure there's nobody hiding in there. He goes up to the second floor. He checks all the different rooms up there and the balcony, makes his way up to the third floor where there's all the offices of staff that work at the theater. At the end of the search, the last room he would check was the rehearsal room. And it was the only room where there was no door to it. So you'd poke your head in, kind of look around, make sure no one was in there, and then you would leave, and that's the end of your check. So Dave gets to the rehearsal room, he flips the light on, and he looks inside, doesn't see anybody, is satisfied that no one's in there, turns the light off, and as he's about to turn back into the hallway, he hears a door slam with tremendous force right across the hallway from where he was, and it was the bathroom door. And his first reaction is someone just ran out of the bathroom. Someone who had snuck into the building must have run out of the bathroom, and they're making a break for it to get out of the theater before I catch them. And so he instinctively picks up his radio and he calls to Morgan and says, someone's on the third floor. But when Morgan looks at the camera, he doesn't see anybody. At this point, Dave's drawn his weapon, and he's looking down the hall, he doesn't see anybody. And as he's waiting for Morgan to come upstairs to back him up so they can go look for this person that's just ran down the hall, he realizes two things. One, just because he heard the door slam doesn't mean they left and slammed it. They could be in the bathroom. And so he's thinking to himself, someone could be in the bathroom right now. Maybe that's why we didn't see him on the camera. And then the second thing he thought of is that door, the bathroom door, can't slam. It's got this huge hydraulic hinge to it. It can't slam. So his gun is drawn and he's aiming it at the bathroom door right as Morgan comes up on his right. Morgan draws his pistol, he's got it on the door as well, and they make entry into the bathroom. They clear all the different spaces in the bathroom and no one's in there, and there's no way to get out of there. Morgan and Dave are like, okay, well, they must not have come in here. They must have run out of the bathroom. They're somewhere in the theater. And so they decide they're going to search the entire building and find this person that clearly was just in the bathroom, and that's how they slammed the door. We're not going to worry about how they slammed the door with the hydraulic hinge. We just know it was slammed somehow. So they leave the bathroom, guns still drawn, and they start making their way down the hall. They're checking all the doors, everything is locked. When they start making their way downstairs to the second floor, Dave recognizes through the door, because there's a door leading onto the second floor, he can see that the lights are on, and he had turned them off. And so as they're walking down the stairs, he says to Morgan, hey, did you turn the lights on the second floor? And Morgan's like, no. And so they think that whoever was here, whoever was in the bathroom is on the second floor. They must have turned the lights on. They go into the second floor, and not only are the lights on, but all the doors on the second floor had been opened. They search the entire second floor. They search every single room. No one's on the second floor. They turn off the lights, they shut all the doors, everything's locked. When they went down to the first floor, everything was the way it should have been, locked, lights off, nothing down there. and they go down to the basement. And even though it was creepy being down there because they've now searched the whole building and they're anticipating coming in contact with whoever is here, assuming they haven't left the building yet, and there's no one down there. They decided to review the footage from the 3rd floor to see if they could pick up someone running in the hall around the time that that door slammed, but the camera was not trained on the bathroom door. So you just have this view down the hall. You can't see the bathroom specifically, not to mention the hallway is dark and the cameras are terrible without light. And so all they're able to see is the light go on in the rehearsal room while Dave is doing his last check in there. The lights turn off because Dave's about to turn around. And then after that, you just hear this massive slam of this door, but you can't see what happened. So they don't know what to make of it. They're both very much on edge that someone might still be in the building. And so they do another sweep of the building and no one's there. And so they decide to just chalk it up and say, we were hearing things and seeing things. I'm sure it's fine. Let's just get out of here. And they leave. A couple of days later, on August 11th, Morgan is working alone. Dave wasn't coming in that day, so Morgan's alone in the theater doing a shift. And at some point in the night, as he's sitting in the control room, he thinks he hears whispering in the hall right behind him. And so after the experience he had with Dave a couple nights ago, he's on edge. So he draws his pistol right away. And so he goes out into the hallway, and immediately when he steps into the hall, the whispering seems to go farther and farther away from him down the hall. So he gets out there, he's looking around, he can't see anything. He makes his way down the hallway towards the stairs that go down into the basement, or if he wanted to go up to the 2nd floor. And when he gets to the top of the stairwell, he's gun drawn, looking down, looking up. He hears what sounds like coughing coming from the basement. And at this point, Morgan said that he was actually pretty scared. I mean, imagine being alone in this theater. Just a couple of days earlier, you've had this weird experience with slamming doors and doors being opened and lights going on that somebody else, another police officer, witnessed with you. You're alone in this theater and you're hearing coughing coming from the basement after hearing voices behind you. That's pretty terrifying. So he very slowly starts going down the stairwell. He's getting ready to clear the corner, and just as he does, the coughing stops. He turns the lights on and he looks down the hall and there's nothing there. He starts making his way down the hall. He's checking every door, making sure it's locked, making sure that everything is secure. And he gets all the way down the hall. And as he's almost done checking the basement, he smells smoke and it's coming from a door right next to him. And so he unlocks that door and he goes in and there's no fire, but all he can smell is smoke. So he turns the light on. He's looking around. There's no fire. He's convinced that somewhere down in the basement there's a fire. He goes to every single room and he keeps checking and there's nothing. And then at some point the smoke smell dissipates. He checks every space in the theater to look for a fire and there's no fire. He's wondering if he should call the fire department, but he's thinking, what would I tell them? There's no fire. And so he ultimately, after checking 3-4 times and being very confident there wasn't a fire, he just says, okay, no fire. I guess I was just smelling things. A few weeks later, on September 4th, Dave has just arrived at the theater. He's there a little bit early. Their shift started at 5 p.m. He was there at about 4:30. And when he walked into the building, he sees that there are 3 staff members sitting at the front desk talking to each other. And as he walks past, one of them is talking about ghosts inside of the theater. And it immediately piques his interest. And so he walked over to the guy talking about ghosts and he introduced himself. And it turned out that this guy was a man named Blair Fuller, who was a senior accountant at the theater. And so Dave asked Blair, what are you talking about with ghosts in the theater? Because I provide physical security here and I've seen some strange things here. I just love to hear what you have to say about it. So they head up to the 3rd floor where Blair's office was and they sit down and Blair says, okay, I got a doozy for you. This happened to me a couple years ago. I was actually in this office. It was about 9-10 o'clock at night. I was doing some work and I heard the elevator kick on. Now, the elevator was right outside of his office, and anytime it was on, the engine was really loud. It was really obvious if the elevator was moving around. And so he's doing his accounting work and he hears that engine kick on. He doesn't think much of it, but then it clicks that he's the only one in the building. And so he kind of looks out the glass window of his office. He had a closed door office with 2 windows looking out into the foyer where there's this elevator. And he looks out and he can see that the little lights above the elevator showing what floor it's on have lit up and it's going up. So the elevator was in the basement and now it's in the 1st floor, the 2nd floor, 3rd floor. The door's open and there's no one there. And at this point, Blair says that he wasn't concerned. He figured, okay, maybe there's some maintenance, maybe it's scheduled to do that, who knows. But after a little while, the alarm goes off in the elevator to signify that something is obstructing the door from shutting. And he's looking out the window and he hears this alarm, this like ringing sound going off, but the door isn't shutting. And he's like, there's nothing obstructing the door. Why isn't it shutting? And so he leaves his office and he kind of walks over to the elevator and he walks into the elevator. And he said immediately he felt this massive drop in temperature inside of the elevator. And as he's standing there, he turns around. Now he's looking back towards his office inside of the elevator. The doors start to shut. And for whatever reason, he said, I didn't get off. I just decided I'm going to ride this elevator. The basement button lights up as if someone had pressed basement, and they start going down. And he's sitting there thinking, what in the world is going on? It was just on an alarm because the door wasn't shutting. And then miraculously, when I go inside of it, it suddenly works again and it's going to the basement. So he goes to the basement, the door opens, there's no one there. He steps out and Blair says that it took all of his courage to yell out, hey, is anyone down here? And as soon as he did and he didn't hear a response, he said he didn't want to make any more sound. The elevator sat in the middle of the hall in the basement. It's that huge hall with that piano sitting right in the middle. The lights are off. And he pokes his head down one way. There's nothing down there. He sees the piano barely from the light of the elevator. And he looks down the other way. There's no one there. And at this point, he's just so spooked. He just gets back in the elevator and he hits floor 3, floor 3, floor 3. And he's hitting like door closed, door closed, door closed. The door closes and he goes back up to his office. He goes into his office and he shuts the door and he sits down and he's thinking like, what was that? Why did that just happen? I got to find out if they're running maintenance or something. And as he's sitting in his chair thinking about this strange experience, he hears what sounds like banging sounds coming from outside of his office in that foyer near the elevator. He just goes to his door and he opens it up and he pokes his head into the foyer and he looks to the side and there's this big filing cabinet and all of the cabinets are out. They've all been pulled out. He certainly didn't do this. And it was as if someone was one by one pushing each of them shut, these big heavy cabinets. And he's watching as one by one these things are slamming shut, one by one until the whole thing is shut. And so he goes over and he's like trying to disprove what he just saw, that he can open up a drawer and that it will shut on its own. But none of them shut on their own. You have to shut it. Something has to shut it for it to shut. And so he packed up for the day and left and did not work another night shift at the theater. Later that night, Dave would share Blair's story with Morgan. He wasn't really sure how Morgan was going to react, but Morgan actually would open up and he would say, you know, before you started working here, I always felt like I was being watched when I was here. And then we had that experience, obviously, where the lights are coming on and you heard that banging from that bathroom door. And then just a few days ago, I heard voices coming from the hall and I heard someone coughing in the basement and I smelled smoke and there was no one there. And so they start going back and forth, exchanging stories of just how uncomfortable this place made them feel. And so they're wondering what they should do about this. And Dave has this idea. He's like, my best friend, I'll invite him to come over here one night and we'll tell him that we're giving him a tour of the building and we'll just see what he says. We'll see if he reacts to anything here. Who knows? You know, maybe something strange will happen and then we'll have another person validate it. Morgan thinks that's a good idea, and so Dave reaches out to his best friend, Greg. Greg would say that he was a little bit surprised to be getting this offer to come take a tour of the theater, but he was interested, and since Dave was asking, he figured he would oblige him. And so Greg agrees to come to the theater and take a tour. So the next day, Dave and Morgan are at the theater and Greg shows up. And so they start this tour. They go in the main auditorium. They're looking around and then they make their way into the basement. Morgan turns on the light and Morgan and Dave instantly see a little ways down the hall on the left, one of the doors has been opened. And so Dave and Morgan push Greg out of the way. They draw their pistols and they're aimed at the open door. And so Greg just stays behind them as Morgan and Dave make their way down to this open door. And when they get right outside the door and they're about to push it open to go inside, the door slams shut right in front of Greg and Dave and Morgan. And they all are looking at each other like, what's going on? But before they can do anything, the door handle starts rattling really aggressively. After the rattling stops, Dave and Morgan look at each other and they nod their head like, we got to go in there. Greg is scared about being out in the hall alone, and so he just follows them in. And so the three of them go into this room. Dave and Morgan are, pistols drawn. It's a small room. There's no one in there. Light switch on, no one in there. Greg suddenly gasps and he points to the corner and he says, someone's sitting in the corner. And Dave and Morgan immediately train their guns on what's in the corner, but no one's there. And Greg's like, I just saw someone sitting in the corner. It looked like he had a hood on, he had like a sweatshirt on, I don't know, but he was right there. And so Dave and Morgan, they're freaked out because they brought Greg here on some level to disprove the strangeness. And now the three of them have seen a door slam that shouldn't have been open in the first place. Greg's claiming to have seen a figure sitting in the corner. This scared the crap out of all three of them. They quickly left, locked, shut off the lights, went upstairs. Greg's like, I'm out of here. Greg leaves. And Dave and Morgan are like, now what? So at this point, all the strangeness that was happening in the theater was getting reported, but it was being reported in a way that Dave and Morgan didn't seem like they were referencing something haunted, but rather someone was breaking in. Ultimately, the county installed new cameras inside of the theater. These updated cameras had infrared technology, which allowed them to see better when the lights were off. They were hoping that this would allow them to catch whoever was breaking in practically every time Dave and Morgan are on shift. So on the day that it was installed, September 15th, Morgan is working there alone. And he's sitting in the control room looking at the different cameras, and he's kind of playing around with the different screens and seeing what each of the cameras can do. And at some point, something catches his eye in one of the screens. In the main auditorium, it appeared like someone might be sitting in one of the seats, but the camera was zoomed back enough that he couldn't get a clear picture, and he didn't know what was normal in any of these cameras because this is the first time he's looking at any of these screens. And so he's looking at the camera really closely, and he thinks he sees someone, he can't really tell, that has a hood on or a shroud on that's just sitting in the middle of the theater. And it starts turning its head like this. And he can see clear as day a set of eyes. And before Morgan has a chance to do it, it just starts raising into the ceiling and disappears. Morgan didn't even check to see what it was. He was done. He literally quit that day. That was his last day at the theater. A couple of weeks after Morgan has quit and Dave is working alone at the theater, he's in the control room, and all of a sudden he hears a piano playing. And there's only one piano in the entire theater, and it's sitting in the basement. It's his job to protect this place, so he knows he has to go down and check because it could be some hooligan in the building somewhere. So he leaves the control room, and as he starts walking over to the stairs with his gun drawn, the music is getting louder and louder. The piano is getting louder and louder and louder. He makes his way down the steps, and as he's about to turn the corner, he hears the guard that protects the keys on the piano slam shut, and the piano stops. Then he turns around the corner and he looks, and there's no one down there. He flips on the light. No one's in the hall. He knows he's not going to find anyone down here. It's this entity that's causing all this mayhem inside of the theater. Dave's seen enough. He's done. He's done with this theater, and he goes right back upstairs. He goes in the control room, locks it, stays there till the end of his shift, and then he is out. And the next day, he goes to his sergeant and he says, "You can't ever put me back inside that theater or I will quit." And so sure enough, he was transferred. Over the next 2 months, they didn't have anyone who could do full-time security at the theater. So different random officers would be there for a couple hours, a couple of days a week, until November 26th. They found another officer, a veteran police officer named Josh Thomas, who was going to be working at the theater full-time. On November 26th, the first night that Josh Thomas was going to be there, he didn't have anyone to turn over with, so he was just alone at the theater. And it just so happens that Dave is in a patrol car near the theater. When at some point in the night, Josh comes over the radio and says, "Hey, I need backup right now. Someone has broken into the theater." Dave knows that it's probably not someone breaking in. He knows what's going on inside that theater. He was the closest to it, and even though he did not want to go, he felt like it was his responsibility to go to that theater and be Josh's backup. And if it was what Dave thought it would be, this entity in the theater, that he would be able to explain to him what he had seen before he ultimately decided never to go back. And when Dave gets to the theater, there's this back door that they would go into, and he sees Josh is standing just outside the theater. And Dave would say that Josh's eyes were, like saucers. He looked terrified. And so Dave has an inkling of what's going on, and he goes over to Josh and he's like, "What's going on? Is someone still in there?" He said that he had been doing security rounds, and he had heard what sounded like voices when he was in the basement, and he didn't think much of it. He checked all the rooms, everything was shut. And when he made his way up to the third floor, he saw that the elevator had kicked on. It was in the basement, and suddenly the light was on and it was whirring up to the third floor. And when the elevator opened up, there was no one there. And he's standing there looking at it, and he looks inside, there's no one there, and then the alarm goes off. That's when he called in for backup. Dave says, "Look, let's just go search the building, we'll do it together." They clear the whole theater, no one's there. And before Dave leaves, they go into the main auditorium where the stage is, and they're just standing on the stage chatting with each other. And Dave, his back is to where the audience would be. And Josh is facing Dave, facing towards the seats. Josh just suddenly stopped. Mid-sentence, he's just frozen and looking just beyond Dave's shoulder. And Dave goes, "What?" And Josh goes, "There's something behind you." Dave slowly turns around, and as soon as he does, he can tell immediately what Josh is looking at. Standing in the very back of the theater away from them is a man standing in the corner with its hands by its sides. Its back is to them, and it's looking down with a hood over its head. Dave turns his whole body around to look at this thing right as this thing turns around real quick and looks directly at them. It has these deep, dark, sunken eyes, and its face looks like it had been very badly burned, like it was black and charred. And it's looking at them before it just turns and runs out the back of the theater. Josh believed that that was an intruder. Dave was fairly certain that that was just another example of this entity that haunts the theater. But they would search the building and they could never find that cloaked figure again. And that was when Dave sat Josh down in the control room and he filled him in on why Morgan had quit and why he ultimately had quit. And he also told him the story from Blair. So Josh is like, great, I'm glad I work here now. This was the last time that Dave would go to the theater. But Dave would do some additional digging on the history of the theater. It would turn out that in the 40s there was this horrible fire and a man had been trapped in the basement when the fire had erupted and he had died inside of the theater. And so Dave would share this information with Morgan and with Josh, and the three of them all believed that what they were witnessing was the ghost of that man who died in that fire. So I'd love to get your reaction to this. Was this a ghost or was this something else? I will get back to all of the early commenters. So get your comments in there, give me your theories, and I'll get back to all of the early commenters. If you enjoyed this story and you haven't already done this, please place the like button's feet in cement and then throw them into the ocean. Also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you have a story suggestion for this channel, it can be your personal story or just a suggested story, please submit it on our subreddit. It's just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. I read that subreddit every day, so I promise I will get to your submission if you put it on there. And a 1979 New York Times article described her story as being, quote, one of the Western world's most intriguing and convincing cases of reincarnation. I myself am not a huge believer in reincarnation, mostly because any of the stories I've heard, there's no modern day corroboration of fact. But in Dorothy Eady's case, or as she became known, Setti's case, she has a number of things that line up with her story, with her lifelong story, that she in fact was from ancient Egypt and was actually a priestess in ancient Egypt times. And some of her discoveries are pretty incredible. And frankly, Egyptologists and historians that have looked at this case have spent decades trying to prove that she was lying, but can't. She had information that she shouldn't have had. That begins to make you wonder, maybe she really was reincarnated. Before we get started, if you could please gently destroy the like button and then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. I'm gonna be posting a ton of content just like this as many times a week as I can. I'm aiming for 3, if not 4, every week going forward, so please come along. The too long didn't read version of this story is you have Dorothy Eady, who as a child has a near-death experience. When she kind of comes back, she believes that she is no longer home, that her home is somewhere else. She starts having dreams about this place. She describes this garden and this big building, and then eventually she discovers that what she's describing is a place in ancient Egypt. And she ends up becoming obsessed with ancient Egypt and then begins providing information and helping with archaeological digs that leads to numerous incredible discoveries, all from memories that she claims to have had from her previous life. Even if you don't believe in reincarnation and this whole story seems like totally made up, just listen to how the story flows and then try to make sense of how in the world she had the information she had that led to distinct discoveries that nobody else had made. That they found this stuff as a result of Dorothy Eady's information. How do we reconcile that? It's not impossible, but no one's been able to do it yet. So let's see what you think. Dorothy Eady was born into a lower middle-class family in London in 1904. She was an only child and she was absolutely adored by her parents. Now, unfortunately, when she was 3 years old, she fell down a flight of stairs in her home and was unconscious. They called the doctor and the doctor shows up and says she's actually dead. As the parents are talking to the doctor, after about an hour, Dorothy gets up and goes into her bedroom and is like playing on her bed. And the parents come in with a doctor and they can't make any sense of it. And in fact, the parents were furious at the doctor for pronouncing her dead, because they're like, obviously she wasn't. If she's just fine now, like, who are you? What kind of doctor are you? But the doctor swears she was dead. Shortly after the accident, Dorothy develops a strange accent that they can't quite place, and doctors and specialists believe that she's suffering from something called foreign accent syndrome, which is fairly common amongst people with significant head injuries. Basically, it alters your speech, and to people that don't know any better, they might think that you just have a strange foreign accent. Dorothy also started telling her parents about this recurring dream she had, where she'd be near this huge building with these big pillars, and she'd be in this beautiful garden. She loved this garden. She talked about the beautiful flowers and her friends that were there, and it was just this unbelievable place. It was like this oasis next to this building. But she didn't know where it was, and she's 3-4 years old, so she's not able to articulate much what this is, but she was just in love with this garden and this location in her dreams, and she talked about it endlessly. Dorothy's mother would find her daughter on her bed either before she went to sleep or when she woke up, crying, because Dorothy longed to actually be in this place in her dreams, which she started calling home. Now, Dorothy's mother would say, but Dorothy, you're home now. And she would say, no, I'm not home. My home is in that garden. It's near that building. And no matter how Dorothy's mother tried to kind of convince her that, no, honey, you live here now, you live here, you've never lived anywhere else, Dorothy was unbelievably convinced that what she was seeing in her dreams was her actual home. It was around this time that Dorothy's parents brought Dorothy to a British museum where they had a big ancient Egyptian exhibit set up. And when they went into the museum, Dorothy sees this exhibit and she's immediately attracted to it. And as she gets closer, she starts seeing the statues of the pharaohs and pictures of the pyramids, and she sprints into the exhibit, runs away from her parents, and she's running to the different statues of the pharaohs and of the Sphinx and all of these different icons from ancient Egypt, and she's kissing their feet and she's sobbing hysterically, and she's yelling, I'm home, I'm with my people. This little tiny kid is having this revelation that she's found home, and she refused to leave the museum. Finally, her parents, get her to calm down. They're pretty embarrassed because people are like looking at them like, what's going on with your child? She finally leaves with her parents, but at this point, now Dorothy has attached that place in her dreams that she longs to go with the beautiful garden. She's attached it to Egypt, to ancient Egypt. And so she becomes completely obsessed with ancient Egypt. Her obsession with ancient Egypt started to get her in trouble. When she'd go to Sunday school, her family is a very, very devout Catholic family. She would compare Catholicism to other ancient Egyptian religions. That got her in a lot of trouble, and in fact, they said, you can't come to Sunday school anymore. Then she got expelled from her Catholic school because she refused to sing a number of the hymns that in some way disparaged ancient Egyptians. She was also told that she could no longer attend Sunday Mass for the same reasons. She was basically not welcome anymore. At 6 years old, Dorothy, who knew how to write and read in English, started to take a keen interest in hieroglyphics, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and she said that they were definitely familiar to her, but she had forgotten how to read it. When she was 7, she was looking through a textbook and she saw a picture of the Temple of Seti I, which is in Abydos, Egypt. And as soon as she saw the picture, it was a big picture of the temple, and then next to it kind of like the broken remains of what looks like maybe a garden of some kind. And she immediately said, that is my home. That's where I'm from, right there, Temple of Seti I in Abydos, Egypt. That's my home. And as she's looking at the picture and she's looking at those kind of tattered, broken remains, I mean, this is thousands of years old, she's looking at the area next to this big temple in the picture, and she's like, that's the garden, but where are the trees? Where is everything? Why does it look like this? Like, she didn't understand that was thousands of years ago that it was a garden, but she saw the picture and immediately knew it as her home. Also in the textbook was the picture of the pharaoh, Seti I, who the temple was named after. And when she saw the picture of the very well-preserved mummy, she was overcome because she claimed to have known him personally. At age 10, Edie was kind of discovered by world-renowned Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge, who offered to teach her how to read and write hieroglyphics, which she picked up almost instantly. Starting at 14, in addition to that recurring dream of the Temple of Seti and the garden right next to the Temple of Seti that she claimed was her home, she started having a recurring nightmare where she, in her former life, was in this subterranean enclosure, and she was being questioned by a high priestess who was demanding that she answered her questions, and when she refused, she was beaten. At 27 years old, Edie meets an Egyptian man and falls in love with him, but also, I'm sure on some level, she was marrying him to secure Egyptian residency, because as soon as they got married, they moved right back to Egypt, where she could be a resident. And actually, when they landed in Egypt, the first thing she did, she's overcome with emotion when she lands, and she starts kissing the ground and crying and saying, "I'm home, I'm home." Dorothy and her Egyptian husband have a son, and they name him Seti, just like the pharaoh Seti. Once Edie moved to Egypt, she started, by her account, getting visits from an entity known as Hor-Ra. Now, Hor-Ra, she claimed, was the spirit of the pharaoh Seti I. She would get into these almost trance-like states at night over that first year she was in Egypt. It was like she'd be sleeping, but then she would get up and be in this trance, and she would start frantically writing in hieroglyphics in the middle of the night. And her husband would wake up and he would see her doing this, and she was like, he couldn't stop her, he couldn't communicate with her. She was just in a trance, recording what she was claiming Hor-Ra was telling her, was dictating to her that she needed to write down. And it was in fact about who she used to be. She used to be, according to Hor-Ra, a woman by the name of Ben Trishit, who lived 3,000 years earlier in the time of Pharaoh Seti I, and who lived in the Temple of Seti in and around that garden. So after a year of her going into these trances and writing in hieroglyphics, she had over 70 pages of transcript of what she claims was her story, and it goes like this. Before being born as Dorothy Edie, she was an Egyptian woman named Ben Trishit. Her father was a soldier, and her mother was a vegetable seller who actually died when she was just 3 years old. Unable to care for her, Ben Trishit's father placed her in the temple of Qam el-Sultan. She was then raised at the temple, where she later became a priestess. When she was 12 years old, Ben Trishit was given two choices: either venture out into the world on her own or become a consecrated virgin and stay at the temple. Ben Trishit decided to take the vows. But a few years later, she meets Pharaoh Seti I, and they end up falling in love, and soon she becomes pregnant. When she is discovered to be pregnant, she was interrogated by the high priest and beaten when she refused to answer, a scene that corresponded to her childhood nightmare. Unwilling to put her beloved Seti through a public scandal, Ben Trishit took her own life. Edie's husband grew increasingly disturbed watching his wife go into these trances and write out the hieroglyphics. I mean, she's amassing all these pages of hieroglyphics. Her whole thing was just too much for him, and so he ultimately filed for divorce in 1936. Following the divorce, Dorothy and her young son leave and go live in another town near the Giza pyramids, and she starts going by the name Seti, which means mother of Seti. So she doesn't go by Dorothy Edie anymore. And at this point, she also takes a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities, and she begins a very lengthy and highly successful career in Egyptology. For nearly 20 years, Seti would research almost exclusively the Temple of Seti I and learn everything about not only the temple, but the people who lived there, because it was where she believed she used to live. But it wouldn't be until 1952, when she's almost in her 50s, that she finally actually steps foot in Abydos. And it was because of a job transfer that put her there. And in fact, she took a pay cut to get this job. She was so desperate to just finally step foot in the place that she believed was her old home. As soon as she walked into the temple, the first thing she says is, "It's as if I've lived here before." And she quickly sets up a office in one of the temple rooms and spends almost all of her time there. And she even befriends a cobra and feeds the cobra daily, and just has this cobra friend that just hangs out with her, which no one could make any sense of. Lots of rumors swirled around whether this woman was sane, but because her contributions to Egyptology were so pronounced and so useful, that she was very highly regarded. But of all of her accomplishments, of all of the things that she did, the thing that she is most known for is when she was able, as soon as she got to the Temple of Seti I, identify exactly where the garden was. For Seti, she'd been having dreams of this garden her whole life. And so she very quickly said, if you dig here, you're going to find this garden. And sure enough, they dug down and there was the garden. And in fact, she had described the layout of the garden, what trees were where, what types of trees were there, and it was all confirmed. And once they dug it up, she was also instrumental in identifying where to dig on the north side of the temple, where she said there was a tunnel that ran underneath. It was a secret tunnel. And sure enough, they dug down, there was the tunnel. That was something that they had never seen before. Only she knew about it, and there was no way she would have known about it without prior knowledge. In addition, she also pointed researchers to search in a specific area, in an area known as the Valley of the Kings, for a tomb, a long forgotten tomb. And sure enough, almost exactly where she described, there was in fact a tomb that had never been discovered before. As much as other Egyptologists did not want to accept Seti's claims that she had been reincarnated, and that's why she has all this knowledge, they wanted, frankly, it to be just the ramblings of a crazy person and it to just be some elaborate hoax, but they couldn't deny the fact that she had intimate knowledge of certainly everything that ever happened at the Temple of Seti I in the time frame that she claimed to have been living there 3,000 years prior. Fascinatingly, right before she died, when she was 81, she said that there was a secret underneath the Temple of Seti I. There was a secret chamber, and there was a secret within that secret chamber. But no one's ever gone down there. No one knows where to begin to look. And so without Seti guiding them, it may be one of those things that we'll just never know. So without any sort of rational explanation for how she would have had all this knowledge or understanding of an ancient culture, it leaves skeptics wondering, is this potentially a real case of reincarnation, or is there a better explanation? And I'd love to hear what you think. After numerous reports that Latoya Ammons was mistreating her children, based on reports that she gave, she was telling police that demons were throwing her kids around the house. Based on those reports, Child Protective Services was sent to do a home study, to go to their house, go to Latoya Ammons' house, and make sure it was a safe, clean place for children to be living. In addition to the case manager, her name was Valerie Washington, who was going to be going over to do this home study, the Lake County Sheriff Department also sent over Lieutenant Gruszka, who would be assisting Valerie and watching the home study take place. When Gruszka arrives at the house, he is met with Valerie Washington, also Latoya Ammons, the mother, and her two sons, Andrew, who's 9, and Amante, who's 7, as well as Latoya's mother, so the boy's grandmother. Her name was Rosa. Washington, the case manager, pulls Gruszka aside out of earshot of Latoya and her family, and she starts telling Gruszka about what happened at the hospital 8 days earlier, because she, the case manager, had already begun investigating Latoya Ammons and that whole situation with her kids. 8 days earlier, Washington was at the hospital, sitting in a waiting room. Washington was with a psychologist, and they were speaking to Rosa, who was the grandmother of these children. In the room was also Andrew, the oldest son, and Amante, the youngest son. And as they're chatting, Amante, the youngest son, stands up and walks to the middle of the waiting room. And his eyes roll back into his skull, and he begins emitting this growling sound that sounded too deep for a boy of 7 years old. The grandmother reacted to it like she had seen it before. She got right up, she marched over to him, and she took him by the hands, and she yelled, "You are not you." And she kept saying that, and the boy's eyes are still back in his head, and he's not responding to anything his grandmother's saying. As Rosa is repeating over and over again, "You are not you," Amante begins backpedaling towards a wall behind him. And Rosa holds his hands the whole time. She's holding his hands firmly. He gets to the wall, and instead of stopping, he puts his foot up against the wall. This is a 7-year-old boy, and begins walking up the wall by pressing against Rosa. And she's holding on tight, and he's pressing back at her and using that weight to walk backwards up the wall. The psychologist in Washington are just watching in disbelief. Rosa's holding on to him as he walks all the way up to where he's on his tippy toes on the wall. And then he flips forward in front of her and lands on his feet on the other side of Rosa. The psychologist and Washington literally run out of the room, and they go get a doctor and they explain what happened. The doctor comes in, not having any clue what to make of this, and just says to the boy, "Can you do that again?" And Amante at this point, his eyes are back to normal, and he's sitting now next to Rosa, and he says, "What? I didn't do anything," and acted like he had not been walking up the walls. Now, it's not in the report how Lieutenant Gruszka responds to Washington's story about the hospital. However, the entire police report that I'm pulling all this information from is written by Lieutenant Gruszka at the end of the investigation. So this exchange between he and the case manager, Washington, about the hospital visit that he was not part of, it apparently carried weight in the entire investigation, that he felt compelled to add it into the report. Even though on paper, you would think if you're doing a home study for this house, why would you incorporate something that didn't have anything to do with the house? It gives you maybe an insight into Lieutenant Gruszka, although his language remains super professional and very pragmatic, that perhaps Lieutenant Gruszka at the end of this investigation was starting to think this might be paranormal. After this story, 2 more police officers show up to the house to assist with this home study. One was Brian Miller and the other was Charles Austin. At this point, the 3 officers, Gruszka, Miller, and Austin, along with the case manager, Washington, begin walking towards the family and towards the front door of the house. LaToya says that she and her kids will not go back in the house because they had moved out very recently because of the strangeness that they claim was happening inside of the house. They felt like they were under attack by demons. And so the police, they needed someone to bring them in. And so Rosa, the grandmother, LaToya's mother, she offered to go in with them. So the house is a single-story, 3-bedroom house. You walk in and you're inside of the screened-in porch. You go into the main level. There's a few bedrooms, and then there's a stairwell that leads down into the basement. And so they go in, and Lieutenant Gruszka is in charge of taking pictures and recording audio the whole time they're in the house. They were not aware that they had already moved out. So it's a bit of an awkward home study because they're not even living there anymore. But either way, they're going to do their job. They're walking around, taking pictures of each of the bedrooms. There's 3 bedrooms, there's a kitchen, basic stuff upstairs. And then they go downstairs to the basement. Now, the basement was where LaToya and her family claimed the majority of the paranormal activity was taking place. The steps leading down to the basement were wood. They went down into the basement. The basement floor was concrete and the walls were concrete blocks. As they go down, Lieutenant Gruszka would notice that there were candles that had been placed all over the basement floor that had burned down to their wick. There was also an altar and a nativity scene that had been placed near the underside of the stairs. And so when Gruszka goes over to take pictures of the altar and the nativity scene, he recognizes that under the stairs, near where those 2 things are placed, it's all dirt. The concrete that made up the floor of the basement had been broken away, and there was jagged pieces of concrete where there should have been a continuous flow of concrete underneath the steps. It had been snapped up and broken away. It was gone. When Rosa was questioned about the strangeness of the basement with all the candles and the altar, she just said that there's a presence down here, and that's all she was able to articulate. The other officers and the case manager and Rosa, they go back upstairs, and Lieutenant Gruszka and Charles Austin, the other officer, they stay in the basement and take a few extra pictures, a couple more underneath the stairs, and just of the candles before they ultimately go upstairs as well. When Gruszka comes upstairs, Rosa's waiting for him, and she's about to turn the light off leading down into the basement, and she asks him, "Did you get any pictures underneath the stairs?" And he said, yeah, I did. I stayed down there and I took some more pictures. She looks at him and she says, "Sometimes at night when we're sleeping on the main floor, we'll hear commotion in the basement. It sounds like maybe someone bumping on the underside of the stairs. And then you hear footsteps walking up the wood steps. And whatever it is stops on the other side of the door leading into the main floor, and it will stay there for hours. We're too scared to open the door to look. Gruszka goes back to his office and he immediately uploads the pictures that he took with a focus on the ones he took in the basement. And he finds that there is a couple pictures he took under the stairs, that in the right-hand corner of the picture, just behind one of the steps, it's partially obscured, is a white mist or a white cloud. And he zooms in on it and he brings in other officers and they look at it, and if you zoom in close enough, it looks like a man's face. As they're zoomed in on this mist underneath the stairs, they can see, only because they've zoomed in, that there appears to be a faint green mist on the left side of the picture. Appears to be a woman's face. Gruszka and Austin, who were the only two in the basement at the time of these pictures taken, swear they did not see a white or green mist under the stairs when they took pictures. Gruszka, again, it doesn't say in the report how he's feeling, but you can imagine he's starting to feel a little bit uneasy about what he's witnessing. Gruszka just goes to his audio recording. And so he fast forwards to the section where he and Austin are alone in the basement taking these additional photos. And you can clearly hear on the recording Gruszka and Austin talking to each other as they're taking these pictures. And at some point, as they're taking these pictures of the basement, a third voice, not Austin, not Gruszka, say directly into the audio recorder,
"Hey."
The audio recorder was one that Gruszka was used to using, and it had never malfunctioned before. And he and Austin were the only ones down there. And so they couldn't explain where the third voice was coming from, and neither could any of the other officers who listened to it. On April 30th, Gruszka set up a meeting with Latoya Ammon's priest, who she was very close with. They were regular churchgoers. This priest, his name was Father Maginot, he had been at the Ammon's residence 5 days before this home visit was done, when Latoya Ammons and her family was still living in that residence. And so Gruszka went to interview him to get a sense of what it was like when they were still living there. Father Maginot said he was there because Latoya had reached out and said, "I don't know what to do because she's claiming there are demons here." And while they're sitting in the living room on the main floor, Father Maginot is telling Gruszka that the bathroom light started flickering on and off. And so it was distracting enough that ultimately Father Maginot got up and walked over to the bathroom, and as soon as he went inside, the flickering stopped. And then he'd go back down and sit down, and it would start again. Repeatedly, Father Maginot would get up when it was flickering, he would go in and it would stop, he'd come back and it would start flickering again. So while this is happening and Father Maginot is going back and forth to the bathroom trying to figure out why the light is flickering, Latoya points out that a liquid is forming on one of the window blinds in the room that they were all sitting in. There was this oily liquid substance that was just kind of trickling down the window blinds. And Father Maginot walks over and looks at it. They're all looking at it, and there's no leak in the ceiling. There's no source for this liquid, and it hadn't been there before. At least that's what Latoya Ammons and her family is saying, that that's not from us. We don't know what that is. As they're looking at this oily substance on the blinds, the cord that controls the blind itself starts swaying back and forth. And everyone's startled as they're looking at it because there's no draft in the room. The window's not open. There's no reason it should be swaying. While they're looking at this cord, Father Maginot looks down and sees this huge footprint in the carpet near where they're standing that was too big to be his, and nobody else in the house had a footprint that was that big. At this point, Father Maginot doesn't think it's safe for the family to be there and advises her to leave. And this would actually be the episode that prompts Latoya Ammons and her family to leave the house and not come back. On May 10th, Lieutenant Gruszka, a new Child Protective Services case manager, and a host of police officers go back to the Ammons residence. The Ammons residence has been unoccupied with all utilities shut off, locked and sealed since the last time they were there, which was on April 27th. So it's a 2-week period that no one has been in the house. But there was a customary follow-up to this house. They had to as part of the home study. When Lieutenant Gruszka arrives at the property, outside is Father Maginot, as well as Latoya Ammons, her mother, Rosa, Latoya's 2 sons, Andrew and Amante, as well as a host of police officers. There's a canine unit that's there. Although it's not said explicitly in the report, it would appear that the reason there's all this additional police presence in a canine unit is because there's enough weirdness being reported about the house. There could be, a home invasion situation happening, that somebody else is living in this house. Any number of things could be happening, but they can't write off all of the strange testimony about what's happening in the house. And so before they go in for this second home study, they have one of the dogs from the canine unit go into the property and search the property for intruders, just in case this was a home invasion or something like that. They wanted to just check the box. So they send the dog in, the dog comes out, hasn't found anything unusual. And so the police, along with Father Maginot, the case manager, and Rosa, they go back into the house. The main level looked untouched. There was nothing strange happening in the main level when they walked around. Nothing was disturbed. It looked like no one had been here in 2 weeks. So they open the door to the basement, they turn on the light, and a couple weird things happen right away. One, they notice that on the steps, on the wooden steps leading into the basement, there is an oily substance with no clear origin that goes all the way down the steps, snakes around the side, and disappears underneath the stairs. As they begin walking down the stairs, the case manager from Child Protective Services happens to touch a cabinet that had been built into the walls along the stairwell leading down into the basement. And immediately she pulls her hand back. She grabs her pinky and she reacts like something had hurt her. And they ask, "Hey, what's going on?" And she's like, "I don't know, I just touched the cabinet and my hand now hurts. My pinky hurts, it's tingling." And it apparently had turned white. We don't have any images to show that, but her pinky basically had been wounded just from touching this cabinet. And so the officers go down into the basement, they follow this oily trail that goes back under the stairs, and they're thinking to themselves, all the utilities have been turned off. There's no reason there should be any water down here. Not to mention there's no origin for this oily substance. And no one's been in the house for the past 2 weeks. So we can't even account for this by saying that one of the family members might have spilled something. And so even though it's not written into the report that they were scared or that they were considering this could be beyond rational explanation, it's clear from what happens next that everybody there was ready to explore the idea that something was happening underneath the steps. Because now the family's claimed there's been something crawling out of there and walking up the stairs at night. You have this strange oily substance coming from the underside of the stairs. You have the white and the green apparition inside of the pictures. Father Maginot suggested that if there was some sort of demonic possession happening in the house, that there's a good chance they would find things underneath the steps that were tied to the family. And so they decide they're gonna dig up the dirt underneath the steps. And so Gruszka begins digging into this dirt patch under the steps. And he makes it about 2 feet down. And he finds a press-on pink fingernail. He also finds women's underwear. And as he keeps digging, he finds a political pin, like for your t-shirt. He also finds the lid to one of the cooking pots from upstairs. He continues to dig and he finds some trash and miscellaneous papers, and it dawns on the group that someone or something is leaving the basement, going into the main section of the house, taking things from the family, going back downstairs, going underneath the steps and burying them, and probably has been for some time. And so at some point they stopped being able to dig any farther. The soil was too hard, so they put the soil back and decide to leave the house. As they're leaving the house, Rosa is the last one to leave, and she actually says, "Hey, come over here." And she's standing in that screened-in porch, and she's looking up at the window blinds. On the window blinds in the house is that same, or it appeared to be the same, oily substance trickling down the blinds that matched the description of what Father Maginot had said he had seen when he was visiting the family before and saw liquid coming down the blinds. And so the officers reacted to this by saying, "Rosa, did you do this? Are you responsible for putting this liquid on the blinds?" And she said no. There was no clear source for this liquid. There was no leak. There was nothing. And so Lieutenant Ruzka wipes the liquid off of the blinds and tells everyone to leave the house. For 25 minutes, they waited. And then they went back inside to see if there was going to be liquid there, and there was. And Father Maginot would say that after that first time he was there and he saw the liquid dripping down, he did some research. And it's very common over the history of time that if there's any sort of demonic possession in a house, that liquids will ooze from different areas in the house. And it's this oily substance that matches the description of what they just saw. At this point, Lieutenant Gruska and the police tell everyone to vacate the premise, they lock it up, and they leave. And that is the end of the police report. Although not included in this police report, where I pulled all of the story from, Charles Austin, who was the other officer who was in the basement with Lieutenant Gruska when they were taking pictures underneath the steps and they heard that voice on the recorder. Well, Charles Austin actually worked for another police department, the Hammond Police Department, and he took some pictures of the outside of this house during the time that no one was staying at the house. And one of the official police pictures shows a shadowy figure standing in the screened-in porch of this house right near where that liquid was dripping down the blinds. In 2014, Zach Bagans, who's a popular paranormal investigator, he hosts the show Ghost Adventures, he purchased the Demon House and filmed a documentary that he called The Demon House, and you can check that out for yourself, and he demolished the house in 2016. So I'd love to get your opinion on this story, because I told it based on information that was available in official police documentation. Now, that doesn't mean that it was paranormal, that this house was haunted, that there were demons there, but it at least makes you wonder what was really happening in that house. If you enjoyed this story, then please, if you would, kindly take the like button out for a nice seafood dinner and then never call it again, and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3 to 4, even 5 video uploads that sound an awful lot like what you just